There are some pivotal pieces of evidence that help us to narrow down the date of the Exodus. We have previously discussed the abandonment of the city of Varus, which gives us a date after which the Exodus must have occurred. But today we are going to discuss the Merneptah Victory Stela, which gives us a date that the Exodus had to occur before. And these two dates give us sort of bookends that we can use to help narrow down the date of the Exodus. This particular stela is known in Egyptology as the Merneptah Victory Stela, but is better known to most people as the Isreal Stela, because it has the earliest mention of the name Israel. The stela talks about the attempted invasion by Libyans during the 5th regnal year of King Merneptah, who was the immediate successor to Ramses II. The stela dates to around 1217 BC, and it is dated to the 3rd month of his 5th regnal year. Most of the stela concerns an attack in the Western Nile Delta by a confederation of Libyan tribes who tried to plunder Egypt for its agricultural wealth. The attack takes place in the 2nd month of the season of harvest, so that timing isn't an accident. In the Great Libyan War inscription at Karnak, which really sort of fleshes out all the details of this Libyan invasion, it mentions that Merneptah responded to this invasion on the 3rd day of the 3rd month of the season of harvest. Now, the Merneptah Victory Stela is actually more of a hymn stela than it is a recording of history. It basically tries to take the events that are recorded in the Great Libyan War inscription and try to look at those events from sort of a different point of view, more of a theophoric, poetic view. So these are two inscriptions that describe the same events. From Egyptian records, the Libyans set up their base camp at the Bahriya and Farafa oases. And it's from those oases that they launched their attack into the Western Nile Delta. And they seem to reach as far as Heliopolis. And it gets to the point where the Egyptians have to wall up their cities, close the walls, to prevent these invasions from happening. Now, long before the battle, Merneptah actually sends out spies to investigate the Libyan invaders. One spy returns with a report that says that the Libyans have come, basically they've made it to the Nile itself, and they're there to just fill their stomachs, essentially eat out all the food of Egypt. So that's why the Libyans are attempting this invasion. It's essentially a food grab. They're trying to do a grocery run on a big, big scale. 14 days after this spy returns his report, Merneptah launches his counterattack. And he basically, for 6 hours, fights the Libyans. And this is where the Isreal Stela gives us some really wonderful details about what actually happened during that attack. And I read from the Isreal Stela. He drove back the Libu, which are the Libyans, who had trod in Egypt. Now, abject terror fills their hearts because of Nile land. Their advance guard, they abandoned their rear. Their legs could not hold firm except to flee. The archers threw away their bows, essentially tossing their rifles. The spirit of their fugitives was miserable from marching. They unbound their water skins thrown to the ground. Their packs taken off and thrown aside. Essentially, they drop all their stuff and run. The despicable fallen chief of the Libu fled in the depths of the night all alone. No plume on his hand, his feet bare. So he runs away without his crown or his shoes. His wives were seized in his presence, and the loaves for his provisions taken away, having no skin of water to sustain him. So he didn't even bring his wives with, he just left his wives to the mercy of the Egyptians. Nice guy. The faces of his brothers were furious, fit to kill him, and his commanders fought amongst themselves. Their tents have been burnt, reduced to ashes. All his goods became food for Egypt's troops. He reached his country, racked with misery. Every survivor in his land was too angry to receive him. Ruler whom an evil fate has deprived of his plume, so they all say of him among the inhabitants of his town. So essentially, the king of Libya manages to convince his neighboring Libyan tribes to go on this campaign to invade Egypt. And then at the first sign of trouble, he drops everything and runs. He leaves his shoes, he leaves his crown, he leaves his wives, he leaves his allies. And he manages to make it back home. However, he's now sort of the source of ridicule because of it. But it's not because of Merneptah's counterattack against the Libyans, for which the Merneptah Victory Stela is so famous. It's famous because it has the first and earliest mention of Israel. And this appears in the Poetic section at the end of the Stela. And I read, "All the rulers are prostrate, saying peace," which is the Semitic word salam, or better known in Hebrew as shalom. "Not one among the 9 bows dare raise his head. Plundered is Libya. Hatti, the Hittites, is at peace. Carried off is Canaan with every evil. Brought away is Ashkelon. Taken is Gezer. Yenoam is reduced to non-existence. Israel is laid waste, having no seed. Kuru, the Hurrians, has become widowed because of the Nile land. All lands together are now at peace. And everyone who roamed about has been subdued by the king of southern and northern Egypt, Bonaray Meriamun, Sonaray Merneptah, given life like Ray daily." Like many Egyptian stelae, this stela is a mix of genres. It has a narrative and a poetic section. Now, if we were using the theoretical suppositions of the documentary hypothesis, we would say that this stela was a mix of authors spread out over long periods of time. And that's because, for the documentary hypothesis, change in genres is a proof of a change in time period and a change in author. But we happen to know the date when this was written. And even though it has a mix of genres, it was all written at the exact same time. Now, the poetic section of the Merneptah Stela is very, very interesting because it does follow the conventions of ancient Near Eastern poetry. It is written in couplets that is used to either contrast or compare two things. And in this particular case, it's using comparison as a means of emphasis. It is to show that Merneptah has subdued all his enemies on all fronts. So we have 4 couplets of places or ethnicities that he's going to compare to show that he has covered all his bases. The first couplet compares the Libyans he just defeated with the Hittites, two great powers that have been subdued and are now at peace. One because they got their butts kicked, the other because there's a treaty in place. The second couplet looks at one of Merneptah's earlier campaigns into the Levant, where Merneptah went into the Levant and actually campaigned. In that second couplet, he compares Canaan, which he's using as a placeholder for Gaza, and Ashkelon. These are two cities on the coast of Palestine. He then compares Gezer with Yenoam, two cities inland. So he's covering the whole Palestine here by using just these four cities. The final couplet here is really interesting for our purposes, because it compares Israel with the Hurrians. Now, these two identifiers are different than the previous six, because they're not place names. They're ethnicities, what we call ethnonyms, names that describe an ethnicity, not a place. The Hurrians are actually the remnants of the defunct Mitanni Empire. When the Mitanni Empire was absorbed, annexed into the Hittite Empire, it left tribes of Mitanni in Canaan who became more or less wandering sojourners. The comparison here between the Israelites and the Hurrians show that both of these groups were more or less wandering tribal groups at the time Merneptah did his invasion. Now, it's interesting because in the Bible, the Hurrians are actually mentioned, but they're not called Hurrians, they're called Hivites. So when you see Hivite, think Hurrian. These are the remnants of the Mitanni Empire. And we are told in Exodus 33:2 that the Lord would drive out various groups of people before the Israelites. And I quote, "And I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite." End quote. Therefore, the Merneptah Victory Stela, the so-called Isreal Stela, is not just important because it gives us the latest possible date that the Israelites could have entered the Promised Land, which is 1217 BC, but it is also important because it reveals to us that this particular date was really early on in the time of the book of Joshua, when Israel just got its foothold in the Promised Land, but had not yet driven out the Hurrians. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. If you appreciate what you heard here, please hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.